It happened the moment Richard Carter called Lisa a failure in front of the client team, and I could see her freeze, her face pale and her hands trembling as she tried to hold herself together while Richard smirked like he owned the room, completely unconcerned that he was humiliating her in front of the very clients she had spent weeks impressing. The room went quiet, not the kind of quiet that comes from shock, but the quiet of fear and submission, the silence of people who knew better than to challenge a man like him. Richard had power, and he used it without mercy. But I wasn't like the others, but I didn't flinch or look away. I felt anger bubbling up inside me, but I held it, letting it simmer. For years, I had watched him crush employees, promote his buddies from his golf club, flirt with interns like the office belonged to him, and take credit for work that wasn't his. HR knew. Everyone knew, and yet as long as he brought in the money, no one dared touch him. People like Richard think silence means loyalty, but what they don't realize is that silence can also mean someone is watching. And I was watching, carefully, waiting for the moment when everything would tip. That night, after everyone had left, I stayed behind. The office was dark except for the glow of my monitor, the quiet hum of computers the only sound. I started typing everything I had collected over months, every email where he claimed credit, every cruel joke, every note I had taken, every screenshot, and every suspicious transaction I had discovered. I wasn't writing a complaint. I was building a case, a record that would make it impossible for him to deny what he had done. Hours later, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the document. 23 pages. Every fact lined up, every detail recorded. I titled it, A Pattern of Abuse. For the first time in years, I felt a dangerous thrill run through me. This wasn't just revenge. This was the moment everything would change. Richard Carter thought he was untouchable, but soon he would find out just how wrong he was, and when it happened, he wouldn't even know it was me who pulled the strings. But I couldn't just end it. I needed to be invisible. I needed Richard to feel the pressure, without knowing who was behind it. So, I did the unthinkable. I printed the pages, folded them neatly, and slid them into an envelope. I left it on HR's desk the next morning, under the cover of the early office hours, when everyone was distracted. No one saw me. No one knew it was me. Before we dive deeper, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, if this were you, what would you have done? All they knew was that the fire had been lit. By the end of the day, HR was in motion. They started pulling reports, summoning Richard into meetings. He had no idea what was happening. The arrogance he wore like a shield was about to crack wide open. And as the days passed, the tension in the office started to change. I saw Richard's confident stride falter. His meetings with HR grew longer. The silence from the top management was telling. I didn't know how long it would take for him to implode, but I knew one thing for sure. The clock was ticking. The first domino had fallen. The fire was set. And now, all I had to do was watch it burn. At first, nothing changed. I waited and watched. It felt like the calm before a storm. Richard continued his usual routine, barking orders, walking through the office with that arrogant smirk of his. But something had shifted. There was a crack in the armor, a subtle change in the air. He didn't know it yet, but the walls were closing in. Then came Tuesday. Richard was called into HR. Nothing unusual. But when he returned, he looked different. His usual swagger was gone. His face was red, his brow slick with sweat. He didn't say a word. He barely made eye contact. It was like he had been punched, but no one had seen the blow. Thursday came. The same thing. He was called in again. This time, his steps were slower, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a man who had been found guilty in a courtroom without even knowing the charges. And then Friday. By the end of the week, Richard was spending more time in HR than he was in his office. The glass-walled conference room, once a symbol of power, became his personal prison. Every time he entered, he walked with the weight of someone who had already lost everything. The irony was delicious. Each meeting with HR was like a mirror, reflecting back everything I had written in that letter. Why did you promote 3 people from your golf club with no qualifications? Why have 5 women left, citing hostile environment? Why do invoices show money routed through shell accounts you signed off on? The questions were sharp, precise, each one like a dagger to his carefully constructed image of invincibility. Richard had no answers. He never did. His empire was built on lies, and now those lies were coming undone, piece by piece. I could see it. I could see him unraveling. The man who once made us all quake in fear was now reduced to a shadow of himself. He barely met anyone's eyes as he passed through the office. His hand shook when he reached for his phone, his jaw clenched as if he were constantly swallowing something bitter. The confidence that had once flowed through him like a river was now a dry, cracked stream. It was almost pitiful. Almost. But there was something satisfying about watching him break, piece by piece. Richard had spent years throwing his weight around, humiliating anyone who wasn't in his circle. He thought he was untouchable, invincible. And now, he was a prisoner of his own making. The office, once filled with fear, now buzzed with something different. Curiosity. People whispered behind closed doors, trying to make sense of what was happening. They knew something was off. They felt the shift. But no one knew the truth. No one except me. I had written the story. I had set the trap. And now I was watching Richard fall into it, step by agonizing step. Every meeting with HR was another nail in his coffin. And the best part? He didn't even know who had driven the hammer. The silence in the office grew louder. No one looked at Richard the same way anymore. He wasn't the boss anymore. He wasn't the man who ran the show. He was just a man who had overstayed his welcome. And he didn't know it yet, but the worst was still coming. It started small, like a crack in a perfect glass. "Why is Richard always in HR?" someone whispered at the copier. "Did you hear the door slam again?" Another voice murmured in the hallway. At first, no one dared to say too much. It was subtle, like the tremor before an earthquake. The whispers lingered, barely more than rumors. But with each passing day, those whispers grew louder, more insistent. "I heard they're investigating him for fraud." Someone said harassment complaints are piling up. Richard's once glorious reputation began to fray at the edges, bit by bit. It was impossible to ignore. His name, once spoken with a mixture of fear and admiration, was now the subject of hushed conversations. People who had once kissed his boots now spoke in quiet, shocked tones. The shift didn't happen overnight, but it was undeniable. One by one, Richard's supporters started to fall away. His favorites, those golf buddies who once crowded his office, stopped having lunch with him. Instead, they avoided him, finding excuses to leave early or take extended breaks. His once-packed calendar was suddenly blank. No one wanted a meeting with the man who was no longer the boss, just a man under investigation. Clients who once couldn't wait to work with Richard now ignored his calls. The deals he had closed with a smile were now gathering dust. The confidence that had fueled him for years? Gone. In its place was a man who was now a stranger in his own office. He wasn't feared anymore. He was radioactive. Richard had become the office pariah, the one person no one wanted to be associated with. People began to avoid his gaze in the halls. Conversations stilled when he entered rooms. His presence, once commanding, now felt like a ticking time bomb. The whispers only grew louder, echoing off the walls like a growing storm. And with every new rumor, the walls closed in tighter. No one believed he could survive this. No one was sure how deep the corruption went. Was he the fraud they suspected? Did he really mistreat his employees the way the whispers suggested? All they knew was that whatever Richard had been, it wasn't enough to save him now. I watched from my desk, keeping my distance, but my mind was racing. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The man who once had everything was now grasping at air. And he had no idea who had made it happen. I could almost feel the electricity in the air. The tension was thick, palpable. The office was a powder keg, waiting for the spark. The next blow would be devastating. But Richard wasn't the one who would strike it. It was already too late for him. He was done. And as the days passed, I could feel something shift inside me. A quiet satisfaction. Watching the fall of someone who thought they were invincible was sweet, but there was something even better coming. Richard had underestimated one thing. Silence doesn't just mean loyalty. Sometimes, it's the sound of a trap closing in. Just when Richard thought the worst was over, everything changed. For weeks, Richard had been walking on eggshells. The once confident executive, whose presence used to make boardrooms fall silent, was now just a man clutching at straws. He smiled too often, apologized too quickly, and laughed at jokes he never used to tolerate. Every HR meeting felt like a ticking time bomb. Every glance from a colleague felt loaded with suspicion. And yet, he clung to the belief that if he just stayed quiet, smoothed things over, played the part of the misunderstood leader, the storm would pass. But the storm wasn't coming. It had already started. When the external auditors arrived, Richard thought it was just another quarterly check, nothing he couldn't charm or manipulate his way through. He didn't know that the truth had already started unraveling behind closed doors. HR hadn't ignored the complaint. They hadn't shredded the evidence. They had escalated it. Quietly. Strategically. The investigators came armed with more than clipboards and spreadsheets. They had everything. Every email. Every questionable invoice. Every fake vendor name linked to one of his offshore accounts. Screenshots. Meeting logs. Even voice recordings. Someone had been meticulous. Someone had been watching. And worst of all, Richard didn't know who. He didn't know who had turned the tide against him, who had seen behind the curtain and decided to burn the whole act down. His accounts were frozen. The company credit cards were disabled. Legal had been notified. He was no longer a protected executive. He was a liability, under a microscope. But that wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. One morning, the office awoke to a bombshell. A document had been circulated anonymously, an excerpt from the original letter. Not the whole thing. Just enough to shake the foundation of Richard's carefully curated reputation. Enough to make whispers turn into roars. Words in bold. Underlined. Shared in break rooms and Slack channels. Repeated harassment of female employees. Potential embezzlement of over $600,000. Fostered a hostile and discriminatory workplace culture. No name was attached to the letter, but it didn't matter. Everyone knew. And just like that, Richard became a ghost. The assistant who had once guarded his calendar like a fortress quietly packed up her desk and disappeared. His lunch table, usually reserved for his closest inner circle, sat empty. The executives who used to hang on his every word now avoided eye contact. He walked the halls, and the silence was louder than any confrontation. He wasn't respected anymore. He was feared, pitted, and ultimately forgotten. He tried to reclaim control. Sent company-wide emails, called emergency meetings, barked orders. But it was too late. The empire he had built, on intimidation, on deceit, on power plays, was crumbling beneath his feet. And for the first time in years, Richard had no one to blame. No one to manipulate. No one to cover for him. Someone had stood up and watched quietly, gathered everything, and waited for the perfect moment. Now Richard sat in his corner office, curtains closed, inbox full of silence, while the company he once ruled moved on without him. He used to be feared. Now he was just invisible. Shoulders slumped. He didn't look like a boss anymore. He looked like a man who knew his time was up. The respect he thought he was entitled to had turned to scorn. The power he had so recklessly abused was now gone. I felt a strange satisfaction, but not for the reasons Richard would have thought. It wasn't about watching him suffer. It was about watching the truth be uncovered, piece by piece. He had built his empire on lies and manipulation, and now every single one of those lies was crashing down in the most public, humiliating way possible. Richard had underestimated one thing: no one is untouchable forever. And even the darkest secrets have a way of coming to light. But the real twist was still to come. The storm hadn't even hit its peak yet. HR didn't fire Richard immediately. They didn't make it easy for him, not like he was used to. Instead, they let him rot. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing one, Richard's situation became more desperate. At first, he tried to maintain his composure, walking around the office with that same smirk, acting like nothing had changed. But there was something different now, something in the air. His usual swagger was gone. His power was slipping, and it was only a matter of time before the people around him started noticing. I could see it, sitting behind my desk every day. The whispers never stopped. The tension hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. Richard's meetings with HR went from occasional to daily, and the reason was obvious to everyone. His empire was crumbling piece by piece. The first thing to go was his popularity. That was the easiest to notice. The very people who had once kissed him now avoided him at all costs. His golf buddies? They were nowhere to be seen. His inner circle disbanded as quickly as the cracks in his reputation widened. Even his assistant, who had been by his side through thick and thin, couldn't take it anymore. She quietly packed up her desk one afternoon. No goodbyes, no words, just silence. The very same silence he had imposed on others for so long. Then came the small but telling changes. His calendar began to clear. There were fewer meetings, fewer client calls. No one in the company was eager to schedule time with him anymore. His phone calls, once answered with urgency, went ignored. The emails he sent out, once treated like royal decrees, were now left unopened. Every time Richard passed through the office, there was a shift in the air. People lowered their voices. Conversations stopped. Eyes averted. His presence, once a sign of authority, now felt like an impending storm. He wasn't the powerful boss he once was. He wasn't even a man of importance anymore. He was just a man. And that's when HR made their move. It wasn't a clean break. It wasn't the swift, sudden decision Richard would have expected. Instead, they allowed the process to drag on. Interrogations became endless, each one a fresh blow to his already damaged pride. Frozen promotions piled up, and each day was like a small death for him. He used to stride into work like a king. Now he slouched in, his shoulders hunched, his head down. His once lavish office? Deserted. The whispers, the rumors, the gossip, they didn't stop. They only grew louder. Every time he walked by, his past mistakes were thrown in his face, like a shattered mirror, one piece at a time. Do you hear what they're saying? Did you hear about that client he lost? Is he really under investigation for fraud? I watched him carefully. My heart didn't race anymore. It wasn't about feeling triumph. It was just waiting for the moment when the walls would close in. I was patient. I had been watching him for so long, I had learned how to wait. And then, on one ordinary Tuesday morning, HR called him in again. By this point, everyone in the office knew what was happening. The entire company had felt it shift, like a weight lifting, or perhaps sinking deeper into the mud. Richard didn't make his usual entrance that day. There was no arrogant flourish. He shuffled in, his tie crooked, his face pale. His hands were shaking. I couldn't see him through the glass walls of HR, but I could feel it. The end was near. The minutes stretched on. By the time he came out, he was a shadow of the man who had once run the office. His face was drained, his eyes hollow. He didn't look at anyone. His movements were mechanical, like someone simply going through the motions of life. He had no power left. And then came the news. Richard was officially terminated pending investigation, HR had said. That was it. The end of his reign. But by then, the damage had already been done. His reputation wasn't bruised anymore. It was obliterated. I stayed anonymous. I had never intended for Richard to know who had written the letter. The idea was simple: let him unravel on his own. Let him feel the weight of his own actions without any direct confrontation. I was a shadow, watching as the man who had made my life hell slowly fell from grace. Richard's final walk out of the office was nothing like the grand exits he'd taken before. No applause. No respectful nods. Just silence. That silence? It was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. It was the same silence he had forced upon all of us for years. The office that had once cowered at his feet now exhaled in unison. No one moved to help him. No one spoke a word to him. Richard Carter, the man who had once ruled this place with an iron fist, was now a ghost. I stayed behind, watching him leave. I wasn't going to gloat. I didn't need to. Watching him leave was enough. And me? I never said a word. He never knew who had written the letter. He never knew who had orchestrated his downfall. All he knew was that the walls had finally closed in, and he had no one left to blame but himself. I had waited for this moment, watched him fall, piece by piece, until he was a shell of the man who once ruled this office with his smug smirk and cruel words. I never raised my voice. I never confronted him. I didn't need to. It started with the letter. That small, anonymous drop in HR's inbox, the carefully crafted document that laid bare every sin Richard had ever committed. Every harassment, every fraudulent action, every moment of abuse he had unleashed on the people around him. It wasn't a complaint. It was a case, one that would dismantle everything he had built. Then came the whispers. They started small, like a crack in the wall, unnoticed at first. But they grew. Have you heard? I think they're investigating him for fraud. The walls that had once been solid around him started to crumble. He never suspected, not once, because he had no idea who was behind it. To him, the silence in the office meant nothing. To him, it was business as usual. But for me, it was everything. I waited patiently, watching Richard navigate his own collapse. He had no idea that every move he made was another step closer to the inevitable. Every HR meeting, every tense conversation. He didn't understand that it was just the beginning. The hammer hadn't dropped yet, but it would. As the investigations ramped up, Richard was no longer the respected boss. He became a ghost, a man haunted by his own sins. His golf buddies disappeared. His assistant left without so much as a goodbye. The office that had once been his kingdom became a prison. People whispered in corners, avoiding his gaze, not because they feared him, but because they knew his days were numbered. He wasn't in control anymore. I was. And when the external auditors came in, it was game over. They pored over his accounts, traced the fake invoices, and uncovered everything. It was a moment of quiet triumph. Richard thought he was still invincible, but what he didn't know was that every piece of evidence I had meticulously collected was now in the hands of people who couldn't be bought, people who had the power to destroy him. Still, I said nothing. The silence was louder than any confrontation could have been. I watched as Richard squirmed under the weight of his own lies, watched as his empire crumbled without a single word from me. He never knew who had orchestrated his fall. He never knew it was me, the person he had ignored, belittled, and mistreated for years. The beauty of it all? He never had the chance to fight back. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic speech.
No epic showdown.
Just endless meetings, whispers, and investigations, all of which slowly suffocated him. The real twist? I wasn't just taking down Richard. I was showing everyone else in that office what happens when silence is weaponized, when patience is used as a tool. They had watched Richard tear down people for years, and now they were watching him crumble in silence. It was the ultimate revenge, not just breaking him, but forcing him to realize that in the end, no one came to his defense. Not a single soul stood by him. And when he left the office for the last time, there was no fanfare.
No farewell speeches.
No respect. Just a hollow silence, the same silence he had imposed on all of us for so long. His name was tarnished, his reputation obliterated. And it wasn't because of a big confrontation or a scandalous revelation. It was because the system he had built was exposed. He was done not because someone had shouted at him, but because someone had quietly pulled the rug out from under him, piece by piece. As Richard walked out the door for the last time, I stayed in the shadows. I never revealed myself.
He never knew it was me.
But he knew he had been undone. He knew the walls had closed in. He knew that everything he had built, his power, his control, his empire, had been taken away, not with anger or violence, but with patience, precision, and silence. So tell me, if your boss made your life hell, would you go for a clean cut? Would you just walk away, get your revenge in an instant, and be done with it? Or would you tie them up slowly, piece by piece, like I did? Would you let their empire fall without them even knowing it was coming? Sometimes, the best revenge isn't loud or dramatic. It's the quiet moments that leave the deepest scars. It's the moments when the victim doesn't even realize they're losing until it's too late. Richard learned that the hard way. And me? I didn't need to be the one to stand up and shout. I just let the system do the work for me. Because when silence is your weapon, you don't need to say a word. And if you liked this story, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more shocking tales. Click the box on the left. Your next adventure is waiting.